Okay, good evening here in Tel Aviv and wherever else you are. We have 3 papers this session. My name is Noah Gerber, and I'm listed here as Ariel Zinder, but that's for technical reasons. Ariel is the, together with Moshe, the heart and soul of this conference, as I understand it. We have 3 papers. Each, I understand, will be 20 minutes. If one wants to continue up to 5 extra minutes, that will be possible. And like in the previous session, as I understand it, we will have the questions at the end. We are essentially, in one paper is being delivered from Southampton. That's the first. The second one from Philadelphia, and the third right here in Tel Aviv. So we begin with Dr. Sonia Zakrzewski, who is a bioarchaeologist who looks at the way identity is imprinted on the biological body. A graduate with a PhD from Cambridge, she is now an associate professor at the University of Southampton. She will talk today about medieval Islamic burials from southern Spain. The floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and to the organisers for inviting me. I feel a little bit like an interloper here as an archaeologist rather than a historian, so bear with me. It's going to be a very different kind of talk for you today. And the first thing I wanted to say was to give you a little bit of a heads up and a warning that I will be showing images of human remains. So I hope that that doesn't cause offence to anybody, but there will be images of human remains from the archaeological work that I've been involved with. So obviously we're all aware of the pillars of Islam, but my interest is understanding how we might recognize certain aspects of those as they imprint upon the body. How does action undertaken affect the body that we find archaeologically? Obviously, some things are never going to leave a mark on the body. So profession of faith, not going to leave a change. But some things like fasting or indeed pilgrimage to Mecca are indeed things we might see in terms of changes in diet or changes in isotope composition. But actually the one I want to talk most about today is the impact of ritual prayer upon the body, because the body is a very plastic substance. The body responds to what we do. And so things that we repeat frequently during life may imprint upon the body. So in that sense, things that happen repeatedly will have multiple times a day throughout one's life will have a bigger impact on the biological body that we as archaeologists can study than a one-off or occasional or monthly occurrence. Yeah, something that only happens once a year, for example. So now the key thing to realize is that the body, as I said, is plastic. It is not static. And this means that it changes in response to what we actually do. Well, obviously nothing technically in the Islamic laws preclude men and women, males and females, from undertaking similar activities. We all are aware that Islamic ideology can lead to a relatively strong or relatively clear gender division of activities and thus a gender division of labour. Given that the body is plastic and malleable, and that's indeed very important because otherwise if we broke a bone, it wouldn't repair itself, it follows that bone morphology will respond to certain stresses and will respond to activity. And so undertaking activity repeatedly may lead to a physical change to that body. The timing and duration of the activity is also important. Activities that we start in childhood or undertake repeatedly have greater impact upon the body, and that's because a child's body is much more malleable because they're growing, so it responds more rapidly, and the bone is very, very active in its remodeling and dynamic in its remodeling. And also, if we do things repeatedly, it has a greater long-term strain impact upon the bone. This means that if you undertake certain activities, certain labours, you will change the muscle activity on the bone, and the bone remodels in response to that. So that means that we would expect that a strong gender-based ideology might lead to gender patterning in differential bodily responses to different activities undertaken. The problem is that here we're talking about gender, but skeletally we're looking at sex. So we're making an assumption that sex and gender are going to be basically matched when we're looking at them skeletally. So that's just a proviso we have to cope with. Now, the site I'm going to talk about is the site of Ithaca. It's circled, it's the site in red on this map of southern Andalusia. And you can see that it is obviously quite close to Córdoba to the northeast and Sevilla to the west. As you're all aware, it was obviously a site of very early battle and early occupation during the Islamic conquest, but the actual maqbara from the center of Ithaca was used all the way through from basically the 8th century through to the 12th century. The picture on the left, you can actually see the Plaza de España during the period of excavation, when the site was excavated in advance of the construction of an underground car park. The actual archaeological work and the bioarchaeological study of the human remains has all been undertaken with the support of the local imam. But the key thing to realize is obviously Ithaca's very strategic location in the Guadalquivir Valley and its proximity to Córdoba, but also to Sevilla. Now, our original interest was trying to understand the composition of the population at the site, to understand whether they were individuals who arrived early with the conquest or whether they were individuals who had converted to Islam right at the outset. And one of the ways we do this is by looking at the variability of the population. So there are morphological patterns that are more commonly found in certain groups, and that we then associate, we try and see if we can find this kind of patterning across the grouping to see how individuals may relate to each other. So if we look at these three skulls here, all from the site of Ithaca from different time periods at the site, we can see that the individual on the left has cheekbones that are projecting and go down, and a relatively narrow nasal area. The nose is quite small. Whereas the individual on the right has a flatter, broader face with a rounded nasal aperture. Now, in traditional forensic anthropological study that is somewhat outdated in its style, the individual on the right would be classified as being from sub-Saharan Africa, and the individuals to the middle and to the left would be more commonly classified as being of European ancestry. But obviously this assumes that individuals fall into one category or another, and doesn't recognize biological variation and biological patterning. So our interest was actually to understand how this pattern changes initially and through time of the cemetery. So one of the things we did was we took more than 50 measurements on each skull, and then we plotted them into multidimensional space. Now, I don't want you to be afraid of this graph. I'm going to talk you through the statistics very, very simply here. So we take approximately 50 measurements of the skull, and we then plot them out. Obviously, 50 points per individual. Each one of these dots is a different skull. If we plotted those, it would be impossible to see in 50-dimensional space. So what we actually do is we simplify it by putting it into a great big point cloud. And in that point cloud of 50-dimensional space, you end up with a sort of rugby ball shape. Now, unfortunately, I'm British, so obviously I think in terms of rugby balls and footballs, but you're basically talking about something that's quite elongated in one direction relative to a football. And so what we've simply done here on this graph is plot out that first function is the long axis of the rugby ball, and the second function is perpendicular to that and is the second major axis of all this multidimensional shape. Now, the individuals from Ithaca who have these 50 measurements are the individuals marked in blue on this graph. And what I've done here is I've compared the Ithaca sample to a whole series of other cranial groups. These include pre-dynastic and early dynastic, dynastic Egyptians, which are the green individuals, a Saite group from North Africa, which is actually Greco-Roman in time period, primarily Greek, which are the brown individuals. Then we have two European groups. So we have the Berg, who are the kind of pinker individuals, and we have the Zalavar, who are yellow. And then we have two African groups who from sub-Saharan Africa. So we have the Dogon from East Africa and the Tata from West Africa. And what you can see, if you look at all of these, the clear thing that you can see is that there is no distinct one separate cluster. So all these groups overlap in terms of their morphology, which shows that there is population interaction between all of them to some extent. But obviously, this graph is, to say the least, a little bit confusing. So if I simply look at the averages of these groups, so all I've done here is plot out the average, you can see that the sample from Ithaca is most similar to the North African group, the Saite group, who are the Greco-Roman North African group. The problem with this is that it really doesn't tell us the amount of variation, but it shows that there is similarity between the Ithaca group with the North Africans and with the Europeans. Well, tell me something I didn't know already. Blame me down. So then what we actually tried to do was to look at how we might get at predicting aspects of morphology. And here we take a complicated approach, but it's really not that hard to understand. So we tell the computer how many population groups there are, and we ask the computer model to develop groups based on morphology. And then it sees whether or not these particular groups that it comes up with match the individual's groups that we've told it already exist. So on the basis of the shape and the patterning of these measurements of the skull, having told it that there are 7 groups, it forms these 7 groups and then tries to match them up with the individuals. And what we can see is that the sample from Ithaca here overlap with all of the other groups apart from the sub-Saharan Tata group. So they are most similar to the Saite group from North Africa, and they're most often misclassified as being from other Europeans, the Zalavara from Hungary, but they're overlapping with all of them. And this shows that there is population continuity and interaction between these groups. There are no distinct outgroups between them. So in that sense, we see huge amounts of variability, but actually the Ithaca sample is relatively homogeneous, and it's most similar to this North African group, but it's got similarities to other groups, as we might expect. So this is based on metric measurements of the skull. We can take a very different kind of approach by looking at non-metrics. These are not measurements, but different forms of identification. It's sort of like if you were to classify individuals on whether their hair was blue or brown, etc. Now, these are traits that we know are inherited in a sort of genetic way, but they're not directly inherited genetically. So it looks like you need to have a whole series of different genetic markers in order to express a particular trait. They have some weird and wonderful names. So for example, this individual on the left, just above the number SI27, we can see that it's got an extra bone here. This is actually bizarrely called osteoponicum because it's most common in modern Japanese groups. But the one thing I can be fairly certain about is that this individual from Ithaca was definitely not Japanese. So we have to ignore the names that people have given to these traits, but think of them in terms of what they might tell us about the population genetics. And we're looking in terms of these traits across the entirety of the skeleton, and both the bone and the teeth. So work done by us and similar work by Casey Bollhoffner has found that there is an increase in variability over the start of the Islamic conquest period. So we get an increase in phenotypic variability through this early Islamic period. And then we follow this up by a period of basically stasis through to the 11th and 12th century. And what it looks like in that sense, the variability seems to be greater in males rather than in females. So that suggests the early period, we're getting in-migration of males into the area and conversion of the females. But during the 11th, from the sort of mid-10th century through to the 12th century, we seem to have no change in variability. And this suggests that we have basically endogamy within the Islamic population in Ithaca. So here at this point, rather than individuals marrying from outside, we have in marriage within the Islamic community in Ithaca. So it could be that we have that's what's going on at this point. But that's telling us about kind of aspects of adult life in terms of when they're buried. But we can also think about what actually happens during childhood. how many individuals really were staying in the area and measuring where their childhood. So one of the other approaches we've taken is to look at strontium ratio. Now, strontium ratio, we're looking at isotopes of a chemical element. So these are simply different formats of the same element. The strontium is in the bedrock, and as the bedrock, it leaches out of the bedrock, is taken up by the plants and then converted into the foods that are eaten. And as we eat those foods, the chemical composition of the bedrock around is taken up by our body. Now, this is important because we take it up in both the teeth and the bones. But bones, we know, change throughout your growth, throughout your life. And that is why we are able to fix broken bones, because your bone remodels. Teeth, however, only develop in childhood. So the chemical composition of the teeth is a marker of where the chemical composition of the area where that child spent their development period, their growth period. So probably where they were born, but at least the period during which their teeth grew. So that's the first sort of 18 years of life. So therefore, we study the enamel for its chemical composition. The other reason we study enamel is that actually it's less susceptible to diagenetic change. So we actually know that the chemical composition is a signal of childhood life location rather than the chemical composition of the soil that is buried in, which can happen with a problem with bone. So here are our results from Ethica. Now, the individuals in pink are our humans, and we've put in a few animals in orange. When we first did this, the individual I've circled in green appeared to be an outlier. And these are the later individuals, and these are the earlier individuals. The green lines are 2 standard deviations. So that gives us a range. And what is clear is that during the later period, all the individuals seem to be born in Ethica. So this is during the 10th to 12th centuries. They all seem to be born in Ethica and dying in Ethica. But during the earlier period, we have most individuals coming from the local area, but these 3 individuals who are from outside, completely different. Interestingly, our comparator animals, who we would expect to be living in the same area, also, some of them seem to be coming from outside. We've got a horse and 2 sheep who seem to be moving into the area. So maybe they came with them, who knows? But it's interesting that these two of them are adult men, and the one that's really come a long distance is the adult female. But what is clear is that from this, albeit a very small sample size, because strontium isotope work is extremely expensive and destructive, so we try to avoid doing it too much, we can't see any clear patterning by sex, but it is clear that during the later period, we seem to have uniformity, so the individuals are staying on site. Now, the other thing we can do is start thinking about body shape and body size. And this leads back to the discussion about differential activity between males and females. So here what I've simply done is plotted out, together with Emma Pomeroy, we've plotted out the stature of males in black and the stature of females in grey. On the right, we have the site of Ethica, and we have La Torrecilla, which is a 11th to 14th century rural site from just outside Granada. It's another Islamic maqbara. And all of these ones earlier are earlier Spanish sites. And so what we can see is that generally the triangle gives you a measure of how much bigger the males are than the females. And what is clear is that during the later Islamic group from La Torrecilla, we can see that there's greater sexual dimorphism. So the males are significantly taller than the females, more so than Ethica. And this suggests that we are seeing greater gender difference as Islam becomes more embedded in Andalusia. We can't be certain about this because our Ethica sample at this point is primarily some of the earlier individuals, but certainly during the 11th to 14th century, we seem to be seeing a greater level of sexual dimorphism. So they're suggesting there are differences between males and females, and we're trying to work on that to understand that a bit more.
I'm sorry, if I may just ask, would you like a few more minutes because your time is rapidly coming to an end?
Great. Yeah, just a couple will be great.
Okay.
Thank you. So then the last thing I really wanted to talk about was the action on the body. So we know that prayer leads to a series of ritual actions, And this will change the bone, leading it to remodel as we go through. So during there we see changes in the knee and the ankle joint associated with the hyperbending of the feet and toes. And what we have found is that if we undertake this ritualized set of behaviors, we're certainly starting to see it. So these are individuals, this is a shin bone, a tibia, and this is an ankle bone, a talus, with bony changes associated with prayer. Now, we also see changes in the toe bones, where the bones are moving around relative to each other. And what's interesting is that over 90% of the individuals from Ithaca experience these changes, whereas if we look at the Christian samples, actually from Lucena, we're actually only finding 25% of individuals have this. So it clearly seems to be something associated with Islam, which is why we're putting it down to prayer. What's interesting is that we actually find similar numbers in 11th and 13th century Murcian Maqbara, and you find this in La Torrecilla, but in a slightly lower level. So clearly, this is also changes in the knee, by the way. These are weird changes in the knee associated with prayer as well. So it looks like we are seeing this distinct change as we go through associated with practicing of prayer. But what is bizarre is that most of the individuals are buried following the expected burial laws, being buried on the right in a simple grave. But as you go through the time period in Ithaca, as you go through into the 10th to the 12th centuries, we actually start to see an elaboration in grave structure. So it looks like the religious rules are being applied less rigorously as we go through the period of Islamic occupation. So this implies that at the outset, individuals are marking their activities and their graves following religious rules rigorously to distinguish themselves from the other religious communities around. But as Islam becomes the normal situation in Ithaca, people are following the social norms and start actually to identify themselves relative to others in the Maqbara itself. So the mortuary roles are reflecting social identities. So I just wanted to finish by basically saying that this is an expression of identity that we can see in the body, and that we can see individuals practicing religious rules, and we can also see it in their burials. And just wanted to thank the curators of the collections, Antonio Fernandez Ugalde, and the others who funded the work or who've actually been part of the research project. And thank you.
Thank you. For a very interesting paper. Now we proceed to Dr. Micha Perry. He teaches medieval Jewish history at the University of Haifa. He has published 2 books. Most recently, Eldad's Travels from the Lost Tribes to the Present. Current research focuses on the social history of Jews and language in the Middle Ages. And he is currently a fellow at the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, from where he joins us today. Micha, the floor is yours. Micha?
Thank you. Yes. Sorry. Just 1 second. After 2 years of Zooming, I'm still having difficulties. Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, even from a distance. And I want to thank Moshe and Ariel for inviting me. I'm a social historian. I don't deal neither with poetry nor philosophy, and I come from the European sphere, so I'm distanced twice over at least. Top of that, I'm an Ashkenazic, so apologies are due. I want to take you to the other side of the frontier to Catalunya, the last Christian frontier during the 10th century in the Iberian Peninsula. And for those of you who have been closed in their houses for 2 years, I want to remind you what a beautiful region that this is. It was rich with Jewish life. You see here the Jewish Kal in Girona, the mikveh that UNESCO decided that it's the most ancient mikveh in Europe, and sites from Barcelona. This is also the site where we have this 12th century translation movement that everybody talks about. Jews and Christians sit together and translate the Arab knowledge into Latin and allow this knowledge to move up to Europe and transform Europe. This is maybe the most significant intellectual movement in Europe during the Middle Ages. We know very well about the famous 12th century school in Toledo in Sicily. We know also about the hero of our talk today, Abraham Berchia, who sits in Barcelona at the beginning of the 12th century, and together with Plato of Tivoli, translates works from Arabic to Latin. But even before that, and here I want to mention the amazing work done by the young at the time, 100 years ago, Milas Vaikrosa, the work about the place of the Gerber of Aurillac, visiting the region of Catalunya in the 10th century and transmitting Arabic mathematical notions and ideas to Northern Europe. At the same time, within the Jewish sphere, we also have this internal translation movement. And we know very well the Ibn Tibunim. Judah ibn Tibon is known as the father of the translators, but he wasn't the father of translators. Translation started well before him. Just for an example here, I'll take Barcelona in the end of the 11th century, beginning of the 12th century. Yehuda Barcelona translates Hebrew formulas in Hebrew. The same happens in Lucena at 1060. Also, we have a movement of translation from Arabic, from Aramaic to Hebrew. Of course, Abraham Berchia, who's hailed to be the first to compose books in the sense of Arabic sciences in Hebrew. And he invented this whole terminology that he needed to do so, that much of it was erased by the Tibunim who overshadowed him. But even before that, the first, as far as I know, probably the first translation from Judeo-Arabic to Hebrew was Reuven Barceloni, might have been Judah Barceloni's teacher, who translated Rav Hai Gaon's Sefer HaMekach VaHaMemkar, the book on selling and buy, a tractate on commerce. In the same region, and this is where, for all this, you didn't need me, in the same region, we have at the same time bilingual charters. We have actually documentations of Jews dealing their businesses, buying, selling lands in Latin and in Hebrew. And these are the documents that I want to use today to see if they could shed new light on what we know about the transmission of knowledge from al-Andalusia to Catalonia and beyond at the time. These documents are from the 11th century. We have quite a few of them, up to 100 documents, 11th century. And the first one is from 974. Let us return just a moment to Avraham Berchia. Avraham Berchia, around 1116, composes a book called Sefer HaMeshicha VaTishboret, the book on the measurement of land. We could title it the book of land survey. This is the manuscript. It was published in a nice edition already in the past century. And if we look at the different portions of this book, it brings definitions and axioms, formulas in math, calculation of the surface of areas, we could call this a geometry, division of area, and measurement of spheres as well. What's interesting with this book is a very large portion of it is actually deals with land survey. It's not only pure math, but it's practical math. This book was translated by Berchia's partner, Plato of Tivoli, as the Liberum Badorum, the book of areas, and reached Europe, where it arrived to the hands of Leonardo da Pisa, known as the Fibonacci, the famous mathematician that incorporated this work into his Practica Geometriae, a book that introduced basically to Europe the Arab numerals and changed European science up to today. So this, up to here, I followed the well-beaten path of transmission of knowledge from Greek into Arabic, from Arabic into Latin, and up to Europe. If we want to look on Balkhia's book, he obviously is writing for someone. Who are these someones? Who are this audience? When we begin the book, he claims that he's talking to the people of France. I have seen most of our generation sages in the land of France who are not knowledgeable in land surveying and division, but they rather disparage it entirely and divide land between the heirs and partners by estimation. They are sinful and guilty. Their mistakes bring people to lose money. And in order to rebuke these people and teach them how they should divide land, he wrote this book. It's also, you see that he's in conversation with somebody, with a dialogue. He talks to him directly in the second person. If you neglect these rules, this art will elude you, etc. And he talks about, I heard one of our people who deals with land survey in the manner of these enormous people, etc., etc. So he's talking to somebody, and he wants to present them with new knowledge. Balkhia's book is based on now lost Arabic translations of Euclid's work on the measurement that was lost. It was preserved in some Arabic translation we have, but the translations that Balkhia probably used were lost. We don't know what they were. There's some speculations about this matter. Though he talks about France, I would claim that he actually speaks to his neighbors in Barcelona. The reasons I will claim so is because we have actual documents I will present today with Jews using as land surveyors. But even before I reach these documents, there's some very good reasons to claim that France in the 11th century terminology is actually Catalunya. First, politically, the region of Catalunya is Marca Hispanica, is part of the Carolingian kingdom. Going over the charters written in the 11th century, we could see that they are all dated to the French kings. Furthermore, this beautiful object called the Barcelona Astrolabe from 980 has two places marked on it. One is Rome, and the other is Francia. Francia is exactly corresponds to the latitude of Barcelona. But even if we don't have to use these documents, we could just use a Jewish author writing in Zaragoza in 1070, Musaji Katila, probably also one of the first translations from Judeo-Arabic to Hebrew. And he says as well, like Ruben Barceloni, by the way, that says he translated these texts for the use of the people of Tzarfat, of France. And he names them by name. Yitzhak Hanaim, son of Shlomo Hanasi. This is a person we know. He was the Nasi at Barcelona at the 11th century. He passed away at 1077, 76. So we see that the terminology at 11th century speaking about France could be definitely also in Catalonia. And then we have the documents. The first document that actually brought me into this research is a document from around the year 1000, from May 1000. And I want to thank the Archivo de la Corona de Aragon that supplied me with a wonderful copy of this document. This is a deed of sale in which Ramon Borel, the Count of Barcelona, sells some land to one Bonson. Some of the land he inherited from dead Jews. So probably the whole background of this story and this paper is the sack of Barcelona by El Mansur at the end of the 10th century. It's a usual deed of sale, but on the margins, at the right and at the bottom, we have some Hebrew inscriptions. At the right side, we could read, in front of me, I, Moshe, measured this land for Don Bonson. In front of these people, the undersigned, with the authorization, Berishion, Don Borel, the Count, and Don Vives, the Bishop. So here we actually meet a Jew that has an official position as a land surveyor. And he actually surveys land being sold for, or in the authorization of, I won't say licensed, but authorized by Don Borel, the Count, and the Bishop. At the bottom of the page, he writes, Ani Moshe hegbalti, I Moshe bordered with bonsom. There's something here, I think it's a translation of a measurement in Latin, 55 in the large measurement. Indeed, within the Latin document, there's one Moshe who borders one of the lands being sold. So we understand why. And he gives a measurement. The measurement he gives in Hebrew is the one that misses in the Latin. So the Hebrew here comes to complement the missing information in the Latin. And this brings us into the whole question of marking land in Catalonia at the 11th century. I'll be very brief about it. We have two methods of measuring land, of marking land. Every charter has to mark exactly the border of the land being sold. One way, which composes more than 90% of the charters, is just stating the names of the neighbors. Talmudic scholars know this as mitzarim. At the right or on the east and the west is Moses, David, Abraham, whoever. This is the most common way. Another way is using linear measurements, units, measurable units. And we have very few of those. One of them is the document that I've just showed you. A scholar called Banks estimates that out of only 36 out of 1,000 of the charters from Barcelona up to 1,200 use measurements. When using measurements, the basic measurements are the dextel. Okay, this I won't go into it, but there's a shift that we see at the turn of the 11th century from very unprecise measurement to more precise measurement, and probably the text that we read in Hebrew, the Medidah Gdolah, the large measurement, talks about the dextel mayor. The moment that I found this land surveyor in Catalunya in year 1000, I started finding more and more documents that Jews used in order to measure land. And you see that Jews use measurements more than border markers. For example, this is a document from 1092, where they use the term kaneh and zeret, a kana and a finger, to measure land. And they translate these into Hebrew, to active Hebrew. Again, I go back to Banks, who I've mentioned before, and he says that a substantial portion of the documents containing the measurements of the period after 1075 involve Jews. And indeed, I think he overestimated, but indeed there are quite a few more than the percentage of Jews among the non-Jews over there that use measurements and exact linear quantities in order to measure the land. The background to all this is sort of a revival of Roman knowledge and the introduction of Arabic knowledge during the 11th century. 100 years before Abraham Balchia wrote his famous book using Arabic knowledge. If we go a bit northern from Barcelona to the monastery of Ripoll, we could see this transition through two manuscripts. The first one, Ripoll 106, is a manuscript that was copied at the end of the 10th century, obviously from an earlier manuscript, and obviously it had a Visigoth history. It's filled with Roman knowledge, mainly the corpus agrimensorium, the land surveying and measuring of the Romans. This is one of the important sources actually that preserve this corpus, the corpus agrimensorium. If we compare this manuscript to another one, the Ripoll 225, and both of these manuscripts are extremely important. This is why they were digitalized and scanned, and you could access them online, the whole thing. This is another scientific manuscript that deals with more or less the same topics, also land measurements and other topics, but we could trace Arab influence within. According to Midas Vaikroza and other scholars, maybe this is the manuscript that Gerber actually used and read. this was maybe part of it were translated by one Lupitus of Barcelona, who's somebody who corresponded with the Gerber and was asked to translate astrological works by one Joseph the Wise Spaniard, that some people have conjured that he was a Jew, maybe even he's Ibn Shafrutz. I find it hard to believe. But this manuscript actually has a Arabic influence in it, in naming, in terms, and in way of thought, without actually citing or translating text. If we look at the topics of these two manuscripts,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but do you need 5 more minutes at the most?
Yes, please.
Okay, so that's okay. All right.
I'll finish within 5 minutes, less than. If we look at the topics in these two manuscripts, most of them are dedicated to astronomy. The Astrolabe takes a large chunk of both manuscripts and probably connects between astronomy and measurements, mathematics, measurement of spaces, and land survey. The difference is that one is Roman and one shows a strong influence of Arabic knowledge. And we see here the shift from Roman knowledge to Greek Arab knowledge, from what in Latin they call the grammatica or the agrimensorum to the practica geometriae, which is based on the Imel Mashiach, the measurement of land and translation of Euclidean knowledge. This knowledge was translated and transmitted to Barcelona. We know this, and for a fact that it was integrated into books written at Barcelona, where Abraham Barchia sat. So Jews are measuring land using a linear measurement in the midst of this knowledge transformation. And I want to propose here a thesis why they turned to this kind of knowledge. And if we look at how charters, Latin charters, were written and performed in Catalonia at the time, we see that the action of writing down a charter involved a markedly Christian ritual, that of perambulation, of walking around the field and marking it, going out of the church, taking oath, carrying crosses around. I wish to propose that Jews actually were excluded, voluntarily or not voluntarily, from such Christian rituals, and that's why they turned to look for neutral ways to mark land. Because they had tied with al-Andalus or with immigrants from al-Andalus, they incorporated Arab precisiveness and way of thinking, measurable units, into their way of writing charters. So we have here at the 9th, 10th century a revival of Roman classical agrimental knowledge. Jews take an active part in land surveying, probably using these methods. And in the 10th, 11th century, we see the initial introduction of Arab practical knowledge. I wish to assume that actually Jews were the agents of this change, introducing new Arab methods in order to use it when they marked and measured land, because they served as land surveyors and they were excluded from other methods that were prevailing at Catalunya at the time. The bottom line is first that Abraham Barchia appears with his work at the end of this long process that started 100 years before him, and that cultural transfer starts from below. And before we have any translations, any text that could prove it, that transmission of ideas already started on the needs of practical knowledge. Thank you.
From body to land, and now we have space. Dr. Amir Ashur is a research fellow at Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Princeton universities on various topics, projects relating to the Cairo Geniza. He also takes part in a project founded by the Ministry of Science of Spain, Judeo-Arabic Legacy of al-Andalus, recently co-authored a monograph on this subject. and today he will present on al-Andalus as attested in the Cairo Geniza. Thank you very much. אז בבקשה, בבקשה. בשמחה רבה.
תפעילי את זה וגם תפעילי share. זה. ואני רוצה F5, נכון? כן. יופי, עובר. Very good. לא, רואים, תלחץ עוד אחד?
לא, בסדר, לא, אנחנו לא רואים את הדוברים.
אוקיי.
לא, כאילו אם זה...
אני לא עושה את הדוברים, אני רוצה...
רק שנראה שיש...
כן. All here, I see it, I see them there, hi. Okay, so I will do a brief introduction of what we have in the Geniza about Andalus, but I want to do something that I didn't plan because I want to connect it to Wasserstein talks, so I will change a little my presentation. Okay, so in the 11th century, we mostly have sporadic discoveries. I don't want to go into it, but you have a few, a short list of some highlights that we have. I skip it. Okay, this is a very nice new discovery by my colleague Jose Martinez Delgado, known as Pepe. He discovered an unknown poem by Ibn Gabirol, and he gave him permission to show it here, and he published it in a Cambridge fragment of the month, but we publish it again in this book. You can see if you want, have the book, and when you finish, please give it to Moshe as a gift. So you see that still there are unrecognized or unknown poems to be discovered. So Pepe discovered it. You can read it if you want. It's very nice, but we'll continue. And another discovery that we made and published in this book and also in a separate article is a letter written by an Andalusian Karaite from the 11th century who writes that he is going to visit Jerusalem, and he asked support of both communities in Egypt, of the Karaite and the Rabbinite, and he said that the Rabbinite were better to give him support. So also you can read it here. I'm not going to deal with it because it was published. If you have time and nothing to do, you can read it. But what I want to concentrate is on the 12th century. Now, why we have a 12th century so a good material from Andalus? So it's thanks to one person called Halfon ben Netanel Halevi. We published, he is the hero of the India book, volume 4. Now, if you hear about India book, I think nobody would expect to find Andalus in India book. But India book, chapter book 4 is almost completely Andalusian. It's called India book thanks to this Khalfon, who was a world trader. He made a trade business from Andalus to the west coast of India. He was a very influential. He was the friend of Judah Halevi, and we have 4 letters of Judah Halevi's hand in the Geniza. They all thanks to him. So what he showed us about Andalus. The commentary of the Talmud, Gvarata, was published many years ago by Margaliot. But what Margaliot did not know is that the copy was made by Khalfon. So Khalfon is responsible for the fact that we have the actual work of Shmuel and Nagid. And since then we discover more copies of it, more fragments from the same work copied by Khalfon. So we know the Andalus legacy, halachic legacy, thanks to our Khalfon. This is and he also was in a close contact with Yosef Ibn Migash. This is a letter is sent to Ibn Migash himself when he asked him to be his student. So we can read. This is I must okay. Khalfon describes his wish to study in Rabbi Yosef Migash Yeshiva in these words: "ואלמד אשר לא למדתי, ואעמוד בסוד אשר לא עמדתי, ואשקוט בין העמודים, לשמוע כלימודים." The same words, the same phrase we find in Judah Halevi when he asked to learn in Yosef Ibn Migash. ואשוב ללמוד אשר לא למדתי, ואעמוד בסוד אשר לא עמדתי, ואשקוט בין העמודים, לשמוע כלימודים. I'm not saying that Judah Halevi copied from Khalfon, but vice versa. I mean, you cannot say such thing on Judah Halevi. I mean, I don't חושד בקשרים. But it shows you how close relation they had. And speaking about Judah Halevi, this is a letter by Judah Halevi in his own hand to Khalfon, asking Khalfon to ask Migash if he can accept him as his student. So you see that Khalfon was very close to Ibn Migash while he is in Lucena. He was so close that Judah Halevi himself asked his assistance. This is one of the, I think, one of the most I say renovations that we have from Khalfon. It's a Rashi commentary copied by the hand of Khalfon to Traket Baba Messiah. Now, we believe it was copied while he is in Lucena in Hari Migash Yeshiva. Why it is important? Because we know from Bin Meir Abulafia, the Rama, he said that he was the first to use Rashi in Andalus, in Spain in 1244. We see that Rashi was already studied 100 years before in Lucena, in the Migash yeshiva. And what is more important is because Migash was actually the teacher or the rabbi of Rabbi Maimonides' father. It is a clue that Maimonides himself knew some parts of Rashi, commentary to the Talmud. And we have, if you check, you can find traces of it in his Mishnah Torah and Mishnah commentary. So it's a whole new knowledge. We didn't know it was. I mean, there was some people who suggested it, like Shema Friedman's brother. Just he has an article called "Is Rashi a Commentary Glimpses in Maimonides?" So we think we can say almost for sure yes, and I can add, I didn't wrote it here. I can add that another scholar who was close to Maimonides, we have a copy of an earlier version of Mishnah Torah with Rashi incipits inside. So Halfon was very important to bring Andalusian Torah studies to the East. This is new. It's last month. I discovered a new poem, unknown poem by Judah Halevi, copied by Halfon. Now, I didn't publish it yet. It is going to be published by Sholomit Elitzur because she's the expert. I told her I'm not going to touch it. Please take it and publish it yourself. But I did publish it in Facebook and Twitter. in a sense, so you can see it there. It's a very. She told me told me it's a huge discovery, an unknown new poem by Judah Halevi, copied by Halfon. I wouldn't give any attention to it unless I recognized the hand. I saw it Halfon. I sent it to Sholomit. She told me, Judah Halevi. This is a very, very exciting, and it is the first time I'm talking about it. It's only 2 months, I think, or less. Now, the end future plans. Moshe Yagur has already started to collect Geniza document with Andalusian names in them. Yeah, it's a very good plan, and Pepe and me are going to start now a research in Cambridge from this summer in order to comb and collect all what we can identify as Andalusian or Spanish or related in Cambridge Geniza collection, with and we hope to publish it in English. This book is in Spanish, so we hope to publish it in English, so wish us luck. That's all. I never to take advantage of my 20 minutes, so you have one more time.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
His handwriting is more legible than
Judah Alevi is a nightmare.
So how long do we have for questions? 7:30. Okay. So the floor is at this point open for questions. If you'd like to raise your hand via the function on Zoom, or anybody from the audience here has a question. Oh,
But it told me.
I see.
David,
Professor David Wasserstein, please. You have to unmute yourself, sir.
Yeah, right. Yes, sorry. I think I've done it now. Thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much, Amir. It was very interesting and I've learned a lot from it. And as you said at the beginning, this has some clear relevance for, or at least some clear potential relevance for everything that I've been saying about Lucena and everything that all of us have been thinking about Lucena. I did wonder, though, about the strength of that link. You suggested that it runs through Khalfon, but Khalfon really was in Egypt most of his life. I know he visited Spain, and I wonder about the significance of that set of facts in relation to a link with Lucena. The dates also suggest are rather later than what we would expect, given the Almoravid story of Lucena, and that would be offer a very interesting complication to what we, I hesitate to use the word know, but still, it would complicate very interestingly what we think we know about the history of Jewish Lucena. So perhaps I could ask you to speculate a little bit further about that.
Yes, actually,
sorry. Before you answer, could I also, since you didn't put the pictures all up on the screen for us, could I ask you to send us, or to send me at least, information about the two publications, the books that you mentioned?
Yes, of course, yes.
I'm sure we'd all like to know that.
Yes, I'll send it. Now, regarding Khalfon and Migash and East, we have a proof, because one of the major rabbis in Cairo in those days, El-Azhar El-Kasabi, applied Khalfon and asked him to ask from Arim Migash a responsa regarding a court issue that happened in Cairo. So we know that the rabbis of Cairo knew about these relations and asked for help. So we have many, not many, but we have few unpublished responses by Arim Migash in the Cairo Geniza, and I think we cannot speculate, but almost be certain that Khalfon is the one who is responsible for bringing it to Cairo, to Egypt. And it's all discussed in India book, which is not India at all. It should have been called Andalus book. So you can see it there.
Volume 4.
Volume 4, yes. Volume 4 has two volumes. A is the introduction, and B are 102 documents fully edited and translated into Hebrew. Can I go now?
Okay, thanks. Unless there are other questions for Amir specifically. Any other questions? Please.
Hi, this is Camilla. I had a question for Sonia. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. I seem to remember something about a maqbara in Pamplona. Is that right?
There's certainly one. Yeah, I think there is one in Pamplona. I don't know it so well, but there's certainly a whole series but they vary how much they've been studied.
Right. From what I recall, they identified North African skeletons by their teeth, which have been filed off or something. Have you found similar specimens? No?
Sadly, no. Was one of the things we looked at was to see whether or not you can see any shaping in the teeth. We didn't even find any North African, the normal classic North African morphologies in dental patterning at all, because you can look at the tooth crown shapes as well, and we didn't see that at all.
All right, interesting, thank you.
Pleasure.
Can I also ask Sonia a question?
Please, Moshe.
So thank you, Sonia. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful presentations. But I wanted to ask Sonia, at the end, you talked about the changes in the bones because of the Muslim period and kneeling. And maybe I missed it, but do you see a difference? You said about differences you can see in migration or in teeth from the early centuries of Islam to later. Do you see, can you trace stricter observance of prayer in later periods, or are they praying 5 times a day from the beginning in your cemetery?
There seems to be a slight decrease in the frequency, in what we think is the frequency of prayer over time. What we haven't yet managed to get permission to do is actually to do isotopic sampling to see if we see changes in dietary consumption across time, because that would be an interesting thing to see whether or not food observances might be changing or not. But it certainly looks like at the outset, there's definitely very clear prayer activity, and it seems to be decreasing over time, but it's only a trend rather than being statistically significant.
Yeah. Thank you.
Pleasure.
David, Professor Wasserstein, please. Again, you have to unmute yourself.
Right, I'm sorry to butt in.
Okay.
I've got a question this time for Sonia Zakrzewski as well. It's fascinating what I'm hearing, and I don't pretend to understand any of it like most people. But I try to take the simplistic negative view here, and in the following sense, I wondered, since I don't think you told us. I saw the picture, and it's a huge cemetery from the look of it that you showed us there. It's wonderful. Must have been enormous, must have held a lot of people over a long period of time. And the one thing I would like to ask is, how many bodies, in fact, have you got, and over what kind of period? And have you got any inscriptions, and how many are men and how many are women?
Okay, so there are 4,000 burials across about 400 years. We have no inscriptions whatsoever, and the sex breakdown is hard off the top of my head. I can't remember exactly, but it's more males than females, but it does vary, because part of the problem is that we have some individuals who are buried individually, and that's wonderful, but every now and again you get a burial pit where it's a whole series of individuals, and we have a best estimate of a minimum number of individuals we have. But the problem is then it's impossible to assign a sex to them, because you don't necessarily have the right bits of the body to get a sex. So we've got, in the individual burials, we definitely have more males than females. What's interesting is that they are all either buried on their backs with their faces towards Mecca, or they're buried on the right-hand side. One of the problems that also arise because of the size of the cemetery and the number of burials is that obviously it's rather hot, and so during excavation some things were uncovered and were open to the atmosphere too quickly, and so the bones started to disintegrate before they were actually able to be conserved and therefore excavated. So you've got some that the minute you touch them, they basically disintegrate. So you look at them and go, I'm not going to get any information out of that one. Let's just leave that to the side and let's focus on the ones that we do actually can try and recover data from. So part of the problem we have is that we know that we might not have a representative assemblage for the entire population, but it certainly grows across the 400 years. Hope that makes sense.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Can I ask, I have a question from Micha. Can you hear me, Micha?
Yes. Who
Yeah.
is this?
Ariel Zimba. Thank you very much to all three speakers. Micha, I wanted to ask you, and this may be just a bit of ignorance on my side. Maybe the answer may be obvious, but my impression from your presentation was that we should somehow think of the translation movement and translating Euclid into Hebrew, for instance. I should phrase this as a question. Do you see such translations as not only an internal Jewish project? I mean, should we think of translating Euclid, for instance, as part of a multicultural or at least bilingual project of transference of knowledge? Or were translations into Hebrew produced specifically for Hebrew readers, for Jews, and everything else that happened was an accident of history or something?
Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, I'm a social historian, not an intellectual historian. But the mere fact that if you look on the people, on the name of the translators, the Jewish translators who translate in the non-Jewish sphere, and those who translate within the Jewish sphere, many times they converge. So obviously these phenomena are related to each other, and they had to be discussed together. My point here was that the intellectual movement comes only at the second and third place. It starts, and this is true to Baghdad in the 8th century as well. It starts with the need for practical knowledge by practitioners. And then the first translators are always something around practical knowledge, if it's measurements, if it's calculations, if it's math, if it's documentary practices, like in Haigon, and only then you have the highbrow translation coming at second place, and definitely I won't distinguish between the movement within the Jewish world and out of the Jewish world. In my view, they're absolutely integral and integrated with each other, and I think that the discussion should be correlated to each other. It happened at the same time, at the same places, by the same people.
Yeah.
More obvious than that, I don't think it should be. Thank you.
Nama Cohen-Onegbi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, all three. Just a few questions of clarification to Sonia, please. You mentioned two things in the end of your talk, which I found very interesting. If you could elaborate a little bit about the differences between the bone structure and the burial aspect, and then the differences between different sites of the bone structure, the one in Pamplona, right? And the other one, can you just explain a little bit more about that?
So what we're seeing is certainly in both in Écija and in Murcia, we're seeing that we get greater prayer activity happening amongst the Islamic assemblage than either of the Christian or Jewish cemeteries that have been studied. And both of them seem to have high levels, which is why we're assuming it's down to prayer, because we can't get ethical permission to actually X-ray living individuals to check, but these are the changes we would expect with ritualized prayer. So we're certainly seeing this change in the Islamic populations of practicing individuals. What we seem to find is a temporal trend that goes down. So it's highest immediately post-conquest and then is going down as if people no longer need to mark their identity in quite such a way by actively practicing in quite the same way. What's interesting is that you get some differences in La Torrecilla, just outside Granada, where it seems to be a bit lower, but that's obviously a later assemblage, but it is still higher levels of these prayer markers than in either the Christian or the Jewish cemeteries around. So that's one thing. What we do also find in Ethica, and seems to also occur to a lesser extent in La Torrecilla, is that you get, over time, there is a trend to a loose marking of grave site. So although there are no texts associated with the actual burial marking, we do seem to see stones marking the location of placing of bodies into the ground, and a change to rigid adherence of being on the right-hand side to being more on the back with a face towards Mecca. So we wonder if it's actually just because at the outset, people are having to mark clearly that they are Muslim rather than Christian or anything else, and that maybe actually later on it's a marking of individuality, or indeed it could simply also be the fact that it depends on who's actually doing the putting of the body into the ground, okay? Because there might be pragmatics associated with who's actually doing that. I hope that makes some sense. Thank you.
You mentioned
Please, Moshe.
Micha, another question for you, please. So you suggested that the use of exact measurements of numbers, right, is adopted by the Jews of Catalonia from al-Andalus, but like the classical Jewish and Islamic way of defining neighbors is through land is through neighbors, no? But do we have evidence that in al-Andalus it was different? It was a unique Andalusian or Western thing?
Do you remember Ella Fleischer's explanation of why poetry in Andalus flourished and not in Baghdad? So the meeting place of two cultures. It couldn't happen in Baghdad, and it couldn't happen. The same happens here. Jews under Christianity in Catalunya need a different method, because the method, the border method used in Catalunya is markedly Christian. It's done through Christian objects, through a Christian ritual, which is not the case, not in Greek sources, Arabic sources, or Hebrew sources prior to that. So because they're excluded from these methods, they need to look for other measures, and they turn to exact measurements. I'm not sure that the exact measurements were brought from Islam. This is not something that was prominent in Islam, you're right. But calculations and the need to verify angles and length and etc. Brought into the introduction of a mathematical thought of preciseness and the introduction of later on of Arabic knowledge. So in this case, the Jewish land surveyors, they were not scholars in Arabic mathematics. They were practitioners who sought new knowledge, who looked for new knowledge, and that's where they found it. And you see that when Barkhia is writing, and other scholars as well, they address this social strata. They talk about them. They want to address them. That was, thank you.
Thank you.
Omer Michaelis, please.
Thank you so much for all three presenters. I want to ask Amir, with regards to the kind of the very interesting figure of Khalfon, and what can we learn from this? Because one way to think of it is that Khalfon is, in a way, an epitome or an exemplary figure in an overall scene of transmission of knowledge from east to west, from west to east. But another way of seeing it is seeing Khalfon as a rather outstanding figure and an exceptional one, doing something almost no one else does. And I wonder, looking at the Geniza, how much is even request for knowledge coming from Spain, different hands involved in transmission of knowledge from Spain? How much do you see it attested in other Geniza documents that are not written by the hand of
Okay, it is a very good question. We don't have, I don't remember that we have anything like him. I mean, we don't have any other figure in his size, in his dimension that was so active in Spain and beyond. We must understand that the Geniza is all accidental. What we have from Khalfon is that we were lucky to have his archive thrown into the Geniza. We don't have other people, but as a world trader is not unique. We have other large traders that were also very knowledgeable of specific knowledge, like Avram Ibn Iju, who was responsible for publishing poems of Judah al-Levi in Yemen. So we have this, but I cannot answer you because, as I told you, Khalfon is a unique example that we're lucky enough to have his archive in the Geniza. Is it answer your question? I mean,
I assumed something along these lines, but I mean, it still makes me wonder. Do we know? Do we have anything like requests for knowledge coming from Spain, written by figures that are in the East?
So what I told is that we have a request by
of responsible by Ibn
rabbi that asked Khalfon to bring him response. So it is, you know, he was some kind of a middleman, of a proxy of knowledge from west to east. Were there other people like this? I think there is another letter in India book that we first thought it was written by Khalfon, but it's not. And he also talked about relationship with Ibn Migash. So we have another Egyptian that might have been in touch with him.
תודה רבה.
You're welcome.
All right. Any further questions? Don't see any hands raised here. Okay, so in that case, we will conclude the session, and please stay tuned for the final panel at 8 o'clock Israel time. Right. Thank you very much.
Oh yeah, sorry.
Right.
Just one quick apology. We couldn't see the slides in Amir Ashur's presentation, but he is, as you can already know, if you don't know before, very generous, and he will send it. Everybody who wants it, just text us in the chat of Zoom or to my email or to Amir, and we can share it here. We will send the link, and we'll send this slide with the references to all the publications. Thank you very much, Amir, and thank you, everybody.